The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Okay, we're going to get started here. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. My name's Yazan Arroyo, and I'm the marketing coordinator here at Auxis. Just to give you some quick background on Auxis, we're a management consulting and outsourcing firm, and we're focused on helping organizations achieve peak performance in their back office operations. Today, we're presenting part one of our robotics process automation webinar series, RPA 101, Getting Your Feet Wet, presented by Eric Libros. Eric is our senior VP, and he leads Auxis's back office optimization practice, and his areas of expertise, include shared services strategy, nearshore outsourcing, and RPA. So before we get started, if anyone has any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll bring them up at the end of the presentation. So now I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Yaslin. Appreciate the introduction and welcome everyone to our webinar, RPA 101, Getting Your Feet Wet. So for today's webinar, what we're going to be focusing on is really kind of an introduction into what RPA is, robotics process automation. We'll talk a little bit about why you would look to use RPA and kind of how it fits into the business operations of today's world. We'll talk about what RPA actually is and really why companies are doing it and what you can expect from it. We're going to talk about some real-world applications of RPA in the business operations today. We're also going to show you a demonstration of a recent RPA application that we employed for one of our clients and talk about a case study of another operation that we looked at where we believe RPA was going to provide a tremendous benefit. And then lastly, we'll spend a little time talking about what it takes to implement RPA. So just to get started, let's provide some context around the discussion of why RPA. So in today's world, as many of you know, the back office operations of most organizations are being tasked to do a lot more with a lot less. They're also being given demands to work differently because of the changing business dynamic that exists in today's world. So the traditional back office model that you see here is represented by what many organizations struggle with. It's heavily transactionally oriented. It focuses a lot on what happened previously, looking backward. Having change happen in that organization is a challenge. A lot of the processes still are very highly manual, and while companies are looking to drive automation, what they're typically seeing is a lot of difficulties achieving that automation, whether that's because it's costly to implement, or there are cultural challenges, or operationally things just don't work as easily as they would like it to. That results in both a higher cost model and the ability not to be as scalable as you'd like to be. But today's business model is changing. Consumers are buying differently. They're looking for different services and solutions. The global business market is attacking both from a competitive perspective as well as from a consumer perspective. You're being asked to provide more information back to the business, and at the end of the day, it leaves precious little time to do the type of higher value work that the business is demanding. What we find when we go into organizations is that most of the time is being spent on transactional activity within the back office. 75, 80, 90% are common numbers that you see of the time, effort, and focus being spent on back office processes versus the ability to provide a more higher value strategic perspective, such as the ability to understand the information that you're transacting on, the ability to provide insights into that information and to help companies look forward, the ability to change and adapt to changing dynamics and to be more scalable as businesses grow and or shrink depending upon the requirements that they have. So today's back office model, the traditional back office, in our opinion, needs to change, isn't going to cut it, and the concept of the modern back office is evolving into something that provides a more strategic, agile, scalable, and cost-effective approach towards supporting business operations. In order to get there, technology has become a major player in in that world. So I go back a long way in doing back office optimization services. I've mostly been doing it my entire business career. And I started in the day when your options were pretty limited. You know, you were getting bigger file cabinets and bigger computer systems, and that was pretty much your choices. In today's world, you have a tremendous amount of tools available to you, and many of them take manual activities and automate them either to bring greater efficiency, productivity, and performance in the back office, or to provide more information that's available. So we're going to spend time talking today about robotics process automation, or RPA, and RPA is one tool of a number that support the concept of the modern back office, but it's one that's getting a lot of hype, a lot of attention, and many companies are looking at it, but there's also a lot of uncertainty around what it really means. So let's spend some time talking about what RPA really is and how it would apply into your operation. The first thing to understand is, and this is what I call the hype slide. So you have a lot of news about RPA and a lot of information coming out about it, but basically it all boils down to the same thing. There's a lot of activities that are still manual today in the back office, and a lot of it can be automated. Many companies are looking at ways to automate those type of operations, and the acquisition of RPA software is growing leaps and bounds year after year. And if you look at the surveys, many companies are already looking at RPA, and the ones who haven't are interested in starting. So RPA is clearly at the forefront of a lot of people's thinking, but the challenge you have with it is a lot of people are still uncertain about what it is, how to employ it, what the benefits are, and how you're going to get there. So that's what we'll spend some time talking about right now. So what is RPA? Well, the first thing is to understand that it's not a robot sitting in your back office performing transactions. And I know that seems silly, but you can't believe how many times I literally get asked that question by clients. Is it a robot sitting in your back office performing transactions? And the answer is no, it's not. It's not a robot, but what it really is it's a capability that combines software and services to essentially take a lot of the manual activities that are happening in a company's back office operations today and automate them by using a computer to essentially mimic the activities that a user would perform. So if you're a user or your process involves accessing systems to retrieve and work with data, to manipulate that data, and to move that data throughout processes, that's something that RPA can take and automate. When you see a user access systems, click on screens, go into fields, enter information, choose from drop downs, take that and move that into another stage of processing. Those are all things that can be performed by a robotic process known as bots or robots or whatever you choose to call them. At the end of the day, it's really a computer performing the manual work, and they're doing it in a much more efficient, with higher levels of productivity and speed than a typical user would. What you see there is the ability to get greater levels of efficiency, greater levels of performance, and in doing it in a way with a much lower cost structure than it would be both to perform it by a human and to implement and integrate typical systems. Because the other major benefit about the RPA environment, it's what we call non-invasive or non-intrusive technology, because it doesn't require you to build into and integrate to existing systems. And for most of us who have been through large-scale systems implementations, we know the time, effort that's involved, the challenge that you run into, and the difficulties of integrating systems that are disconnected and getting data to pass back and forth. Well, that can solve a lot of business problems, but it also creates other business problems, and it's timely and costly to implement, and it requires extensive support of your IT organization. So what RPA is a way to really minimize the amount of effort that's involved in doing all of those things by essentially creating another type of user that accesses and sits on top of the existing software and the existing systems and performs the activities of that user without actually being integrated into it. RPA is not a new technology. It's been around for a while. It's just getting a lot of attention in the last year or two. So RPA probably has been prevalent in a lot of organizations since maybe the mid-2000s. But what's happened is it was typically the purview of very large organizations doing certain selective type of work that involved a lot of people doing very transactional, manual data entry type work. So if you look at the pie chart on the left, it's showing today's world of what RPA really looks like. And what you're seeing now is it's no longer just the world of the large global enterprise. So this pie chart shows that about 2/3 of the RPA users are of 1 billion or more in revenue, but it also shows you that 1/3 fall underneath that number. So there's a lot more market presence for small to mid-sized companies, as well as these larger enterprises. And what you're seeing in the pie chart on the right is the fact that from an industry perspective, it's also being much more spread throughout various industries, and is much more diverse penetration of markets. So the large chunk that you see there, the 32%, that represents the banking, financial services, and insurance industries. And those were the early pioneers in the use of RPA. So what those organizations typically had that made RPA very significant was large rooms of people who had to take data, whether it's an input form or some type of information form that was being provided, and take that information and move it into and enter it into another system and manipulate that data somehow. So RPA was able to take a lot of those activities and automate them so that when the ability to take that information and bring it in and do that in an automated fashion, now instead of requiring literally hundreds of people in a large room performing the work, now would require maybe 10 to 20% of that and some robots to perform the heavy lifting and the users to provide support to that operation. So there was a significant cost savings and a significant benefit and a significant process efficiency that was achieved by these early pioneers in RPA. But what you're starting to see today is it's being spread into other smaller businesses. One of the challenges that I have when I go to conferences and talk to RPA vendors is, they still talk about hundreds of users and dozens of bots working in an operation to support the business. Well, most back office operations don't fit that profile. You're talking about maybe 100 users in total. Maybe, maybe you'll have, 20 doing accounting and 15 doing accounts payable and things like that. So a lot smaller footprint. Does RPA apply there? Well, the answer is yes, and you're starting to see it in the sectors that it's penetrating. So you're seeing it no longer just the purview of these large banking and financial services companies, but you're seeing it in manufacturing and consumer products and retail and hospitality and healthcare and telco and just about every other type of organization. And this chart is going to continue to change and evolve as more and more companies adopt RPA. RPA has become one of the standards of how companies are looking to achieve performance, and you'll see it in more and more places. And the testament that you really get to see how prevalent it is you can't go to any shared services or operational conference without it essentially being all about RPA. There's a lot of interest, and a lot of companies are implementing it. So if you are going to implement RPA, where does it make sense and how does it make sense? And the answer goes back to what these original companies started to look at was areas of high transactional activity that essentially didn't necessarily require a lot of human intervention. It was just basically the movement of data. So it's ideal for repetitive activities, strongly rules-based activities where you don't need a lot of human intervention to support the transaction. Having said that, let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into that and really understand what that means. So to start with, and this really goes to what we talked about initially, anywhere that you see large volumes of people doing the same task is a good candidate for RPA. Because if you have a lot of people doing the same thing, there's a good chance that you can automate some or all a part of those activities and reduce not only the headcount to perform it, but also to change the dynamic of the work being done from pure data entry into more higher value exception-based handling type of work. But the other things that RPA supports and you should look for when you're trying to consider where RPA makes sense would be anything that has fairly well-defined business rules can be supported well by RPA. If you require a lot of judgment, there's less of a of a good support model within RPA, although it depends on the type of judgment and the degree of flexibility that there is within the business rules. But typically you want to look for fairly well-defined business rules when a transaction can be easily resolved without a lot of judgment being involved. Another great candidate for RPA implementations would be any transaction that requires accessing multiple systems. So if you have to go in and out of systems to perform one single transaction, so maybe you're going into an order entry system, to an ERP system, into some other, CRM type of system, and it's all part of one transaction, great candidate for RPA. Why? Because the time it takes a user to access all of those different systems would be quickly accelerated, tremendously improved upon through an automated process. One of the things that the robot requires is structured and digital data. So when you see structured and digital data available, it's a great candidate for RPA. So when you see what do I mean by structured and digital data? So structured and digital data essentially is data that comes out of a system, out of a computer. It's already been turned into a digital format, and a computer can just take it and move it. If the data is not structured, if the data is unstructured or non-digital, such as a written form, it still can be converted into a robotic process through the use of OCR, or optical character recognition software, but it depends on the type of data and how that information is being presented to determine the effectiveness of that process. But even there, you can pull the key data elements out of it and then let the robot pick it up. We'll speak about that more in a little while. Other examples of where robotics makes a lot of sense is if there's a process that requires a lot of human intervention, that often results in a lot of human error. People make mistakes. Robots typically don't make mistakes. So if you're seeing a lot of error in a process, there's a good chance you could automate it and correct a lot of that. We already talked about the ability to limit the amount of exception handling or human intervention. So that's not typically a great candidate, but again, you want to look at those processes and see, does it really make sense? Because there are not necessarily all parts of a process that have to be automated. Only you can take parts of it and just leave behind the final decision point. And again, I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of good candidates within your back office operations for RPA, but what you're really looking for are the things that make the most sense and where the business can really benefit. And we'll talk about a process of how to figure that out as we get further into the webinar. The next question comes up is, why are companies looking for RPA, and what are some of the benefits that they're expecting to receive? So at the end of the day, it's really about two main things. It's about productivity and it's about cost. So if you're looking at productivity and what some of the hard benefits are from an RPA environment, let's consider what the robot really does. So if you have a human worker performing a task, typically they're going to work an 8-hour day. But as most of us know, a human worker working an 8-hour day isn't actually going to be productive for those 8 hours. Maybe they're going to be productive for 6 hours if you also account for, lunch, and you account for, any breaks, and you account for a little bit of Facebook time, or, some texting, but you also account for meetings and other, non-productive type of activities that a person has to attend to that separates them from doing the transactional tasks that they have to do. Well, the good news is the robot does not take breaks, does not smoke cigarettes, does not go on Facebook. It doesn't even take lunch. Basically, what it does is it performs transactions. So in an 8-hour day, a robot will perform for 8 hours. And actually, in a 24-hour day, a robot can perform for 24 hours. So if you consider that a human worker is going to work an 8-hour day, but actually only be productive for 6, and a robot can be productive for 24 hours. The math basically tells you that by definition, a robot can be 4 times as productive as a human being can. And that's not even accounting for the speed and efficiency that a robot will perform a certain transaction. So your companies are seeing 40, 50, 60, 70, even 100% productivity and efficiency gains through the use of robots because of the ability to leverage robots for not only speed, but also greater levels of productivity within a certain operation. That ultimately translates into cost savings. So when you're making the investment in a robotic environment, one of the things you should be looking for is, do I get a good return on that investment? Can I save cost to my operation? You're going to make an investment, you're going to acquire software, you're going to implement that software. There is a cost associated with that. When you factor all of that in, typically what we're seeing is the cost savings still results in anywhere from 40 to 80% savings, depending upon the range of the opportunity. So those are the hard benefits, but there's some soft benefits that people get as well. So for example, better accuracy and control. When a robot is performing its work, it should be 100% accurate. We'll talk more about that, but at the end of the day, when a robot is set up properly, it's going to be 100% accurate. The data that's coming in and the data that's going out should all be correct in the way it's being entered. Human beings, when they do data entry, they make mistakes. Robots, when they're doing data entry, they don't. So from an accuracy perspective, from the ability to have zero error rates, it's a great addition. It eliminates a certain amount of rework, and it also increases the efficiency and effectiveness of the operation. The other thing that you get from an RPA environment is greater levels of control. And that seems almost counterintuitive, because you're saying, well, I don't have my people, I don't see what they're doing, how do I know if I have more control? But the reason you have more control is the robot is performing exactly what you're asking it to do and the way it's set up to do it, but you also have the ability to review and audit every step in the process. So every step a robot takes, every task a robot performs is recorded and is available for either review to see if you want to audit the process, or to determine if any errors occurred. The robotic environment has tremendous visibility into its operations, much higher typically than in your normal business operations. A robotic environment also gives you the ability to easily scale up or down depending upon your operating model, if you have a seasonality type of business, or if you have one that you're having some dynamics in your sales, whether they're going up or down. It's a lot easier to implement and leverage robots. Once you've created the program for a robot, the robot just performs the task, versus hiring new people, training new people, replacing people. The scalability process is much simpler in a robotic environment. And then lastly, because you have all of this information available and you have all of this transactional work being done, what the robotic environment gives you is the ability to, as we talked about in that more modern back office model, have a greater strategic focus. You take the people who are knowledgeable of your business, who are today's world are performing a lot of transactional work, and you give them the ability to perform higher value work, whether it's resolving exceptions and focusing on getting exceptions resolved more quickly, supporting customer inquiries or issues, providing analytics to the data that they're currently managing. That's greater strategic focus comes from the ability to minimize the amount of transactional work that's being performed by users, and then maximizing the time spent on these other areas. So robotics can provide that as well. By the same token, people have a lot of common concerns about RPA, and let's talk a little bit about what they are and see if we can address some of those. So it starts with accuracy. So I've mentioned that the robot performs 100% accurately. Well, how do I know that that's the case? Well, the reason you know it's the case is you don't implement it until it does. Basically, what happens in a robotic environment is the steps and activities that a user is performing is captured, literally documented step by step, to understand every step that's being taken to perform a transaction. When an exception occurs, what if this type of scenario happens? How do you respond to it? All of those steps are captured and recorded, and that then is turned over to literally programmers who program the robotic infrastructure to support those transactions. So the robot essentially is programmed, coded, to do the steps that it's being asked to do. If the transaction flow is correct, if the steps involved are correct, if the exceptions are correct, and how it handles all of that, if the information flow works, then in theory, the transaction should be accurate and should be 100% correct. So for example, if a robot is copying and pasting data from one place to another, it's not going to have the ability to transpose the data like sometimes that happens when a user enters the information, because it's strictly a copy and paste function. So you're seeing accuracy in the process. But at the end of the day, like any other system, You don't implement it until you get to the point that you know it's 100% accurate. So you configure it, you test it, and then you retest it until you're sure that it's 100% accurate, at which point you bring it out into your operation. So by definition, once it's implemented, if the testing is accurate and the testing is complete and rigorous, you should be 100% accurate. What about the robots handling various tasks and volumes, and what happens if there's issues within the environment? So let's talk a little bit about that. So the first question is volumes. How do you know what the volume the robot can handle? The robot can handle basically the amount of tasks that it can handle based on the amount of the volume of transactions and the time it takes to perform those transactions. So we'll talk about our assessment methodology, but when we perform an initial assessment, what we do is we literally time that out. It's a math exercise. A human being performs these steps in a process. It takes this amount of time to do each step in the process. You add all of that up, and that's how much time it takes to complete a process. Then you look at where the robot would impact that, and you say, okay, if it takes a human 2 minutes to do that and a robot 15 seconds, that's the volume increase that you're going to get. That's the productivity and efficiency levels you're going to get. So you do the math and you say a robot can handle this amount of volume times this amount of time, and that's how you get to the result. So you know the robot can handle a certain amount of volume. You have to manage the amount of transactions and the flow of those transactions to determine what volume it is and how many robots literally that you need in order to perform that transaction. The thing is, a robot performs a transaction at a time and completes that transaction the way it's set up. So the question, can a robot multitask? It can, but not at the same time. So I guess by definition, no. A robot, it can be developed and to support multiple transaction types, multiple functions, multiple activities, but it needs to complete the task it's been set up to do until that task is run its course. So if you're, for example, doing invoice processing, a robot will process all invoices until it gets to the point that no longer invoices are available, and it completes that task, at which point you can then ask it to do another task. So it can't do 2 tasks at the same time, but it can do sequentially different levels of tasks. And what happens if a system issue occurs? Well, that's a whole other set of parameters. So there's 2 ways to look at systems issues. One is an issue occurring within a transaction. Is it a processing issue? Is it is it within the transaction itself? Is the data wrong? An example would be a mismatch between an invoice and a purchase order. That's not really a systems issue. That's a transactional issue that the robot would identify and alert. So the robot handles that by basically saying, this is an issue, somebody needs to look at it and resolve it. The other type of issue that can occur is truly what a systems issue is, which is you're having a network failure, or you're having the code breaks or something like that. Those things happen and can create issues within the robotic environment. But it's what's important to understand is within an RPA environment, you're now creating a different level of support that's needed. So when you have an RPA operating environment, there typically should be tools in that environment to monitor the robot's performance and identify any issues that come up. So what will happen is the robot will try to complete a task it can't because it runs into an infrastructure problem, the network is down, etc. It should be able to send an alert to a monitoring location that should be received by somebody who then acts upon it. So it doesn't just stop the processing, it alerts and lets somebody know that an issue has occurred. Typically in an RPA environment, you need to have an RPA administration function available to support those types of transactions and those types of activities. So RPA is not a one-off standalone situation. Once you fully invest in it, the support model needs to be available as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. How do I know what the bot is doing? As we've already talked about, it's an auditable log of every action. So we know that the robot can perform the transactions and is performing the transactions because everything is checked upon and is available for review. Same thing with workflow and approvals. You create an approval process that the user routes it through to various stages. The robot manages that process, receives it back, but all of those steps are auditable. In terms of security and controls, it's one of the key questions that we typically get asked about the robotic environment. So here's the good news, bad news. The good news is that the robotic process is basically under the guidelines and controls of your existing systems infrastructure and security infrastructure. So if your network environment and your authorizations and your connectivity solutions are solid and well developed, the robot environment will operate under that. The bad news is if it's not, you'll have the same sets of issues that you would have if it was a user. Remember, the robot is a user on your system. So it has the same levels of controls, the same levels of limited access, the same levels of accessibility and lack of accessibility that any user would have. So it's all subject to the ability of your operating environment to have a solid security infrastructure. And if it does, the robot should be as secure as any other transaction processing environment in your operation. In terms of IT support, another question I get asked a lot. So again, this is kind of a yes or no question. Yes and no question, I should say. So does it require IT support? Well, not in the traditional sense in that you don't need the IT department to build an integration and spend months supporting the business operation and learning the transaction. It still, however, does need to be developed and implemented, but I will tell you that most organizations don't have the technology in place to the experience with the technology in place to support that type of model. So for most companies, it's going to probably be a third party providing it and providing support to your business infrastructure. Where you do need IT support is you need the IT to set the robot up as a user. You need the IT department to support the user administration, just like it would any other user in that environment. And then most importantly, there needs to be extensive communication between the internal IT department and the RPA environment, because if, for example, you're doing a systems upgrade and you're looking to you're changing the way a transaction flows in a system, or screens change, or even fields change in a system, the robot will not know that unless it's being told to change where it's looking for information or it's looking to place information. So in other words, if a robot is looking to go to this screen in this field, and this screen in this field is no longer on that screen and in that location, the robot needs to be updated. If those changes occur and IT does not inform the business of those changes, the robot will not work properly. So communication between IT and the RPA administration is very critical and needs to be done. Where RPA administration sits depends on your organization. It could stay within IT. It could also stay within the business. It's something we'll address in the next webinar series. So let's talk about where RPA really is being applied in today's world and how companies are using it. So we've talked already about some of this, but these are just good examples of the applications of RPA in the common business world. So basically what you're seeing is these repetitive tasks, these data entry tasks, data cleanup, file transfers, ERP entry, all of these types of activities are typical good examples of how RPA is being utilized in the business world today. From a functional perspective, here you're looking at some good examples within P2P, purchase to pay and order to cash, where, for example, invoice processing is a very common application of RPA, where you're basically receiving invoices, entering the information and processing and getting ready for payment. Very common application of RPA, but there's a lot of other areas within P2P that RPA makes a lot of sense. On the order to cash side, you have very similar applications. So for example, processing customer invoices, processing customer orders, applying cash, all great examples of it. Yesterday, I was at a client and we were talking about some of their business operations and focusing in the area of accounts receivable. And one of the things we talked about was credit management. And credit management, typically, most companies want to have control over. They want to have good visibility into who's being approved for credit and how much credit they have and how well their customers are managing to the credit. Well, what we talked about and what kind of opened their eyes was there's a lot of steps in that credit management process that don't necessarily require a person to sit there and perform those activities. So for example, when you receive a credit form and you have to go out and enter that customer in your system and then go out and do the research, go to Dun & Bradstreet and other credit sources and pull information from them and compile all that information, at the end of the day, it's once you've received all that information, you look at it and you make a judgment. Well, the time it takes to pull all that information together and enter that data into one place is time that you could leverage a robot to minimize the effort involved in doing this task, and then just use the human processor to review the data and approve or disapprove the customer's credit. So looking at ways to apply RPA within a process is a critical step, and you're going to find a lot of little mini applets, as I like to call it, where you can take RPA and it'll bring a quick benefit. The question becomes, where in the process do you stop and have human intervention involved? That's all part of the design effort that you have to do. Here's some other examples functionally of different applications. So here you're seeing some in the accounting areas of things like reconciliations, even journal entry, basic journal entry processing, the ability to compile and produce reports, commonly seeing robotic processes performing all of that. Lots of applications in the HR area, whether it's employee administration or benefits administration or even employee support and self-service. Some of those things lend itself very well to the robotic environment. I thought it'd be helpful to look at an industry that's, as I mentioned, has been a pioneer in the use of robotic processes. And as you can see in the insurance industry here, there's lots of areas, common areas where RPA has been employed and is currently in place. So you have, whether it's, entering customer information or looking at examining claims or compiling data to review claims or providing quotes, all of these types of areas have been transitioned heavily to robotic process within the insurance industry. What that industry has done is they've really changed the dynamic of the workforce. So instead of having, as I mentioned, large rooms of people doing highly manual data entry related tasks, they're taking the RPA environment, allowing that to do a lot of those tasks, and then transitioning the role of the user to the more complex exception handling types of activities and having people who are specifically trained to resolve those types of activities. So if you can automate 75% of a job and then 25% is what you have to focus on, I think by definition you'd agree you're going to be much more effective from a customer service perspective. Your throughput, your turnaround time will be faster. You'll have better compliance. You'll have better service level standards. That's what the industry is seeing. That's what they've implemented, and that's what the benefits that they're getting. So it's very common to see RPA employed for a lot of these transactions types and the more complex exception handling type of activities being employed by very specially skilled people. So what I thought I'd do now is we've been talking a lot about it, let's provide a video example. So what we have here is, this is a demonstration of a recent process that we've automated for one of our clients. It's an accounts payable function. It's invoice processing. It's a good example of how the robotic environment will work. So instead of me doing all the talking, I'm going to let our robot do all the talking. This is our video, and let them spend some time showing you what we've been talking about. Yaslin, could you run the video, please?
I don't know why it's not telling me that.
Stop it. All right, guys, unfortunately, it looks like we're having technical difficulties. So this is a robotic process where we need human intervention. So I'll intervene here. So basically what we're going to show you is a process where we've taken an accounts payable process, invoice entry, and we're going to show you how we've pulled data from a document management system. We're going to extract the invoice data from the system, drop it into an Excel spreadsheet, and then at which point the robot will pick it up and do the data entry into into the existing ERP system. Apparently, I'm told it's working now. So, robot, take over.
Welcome to this Auxis RPA demo. Our purpose is to show you how our robot is able to process a vendor invoice in an Oracle ERP accounts payable module. This robot was configured leveraging one of the leading RPA software platforms. Before we start, here is a quick summary of the different steps the robot will be performing. First, the robot will extract the invoice data from the document management system and input into an Excel spreadsheet. This information includes vendor ID, invoice number, invoice date, amount, approver, GL account, among other key fields. The Excel file serves as a control log that keeps track of all the invoices processed by the robot and the status of each invoice. If an error occurs, this log provides visibility to the AP team of which invoices had an error versus which ones were processed successfully. Second, the robot will log into Oracle using its assigned credentials, user and password. Third, the robot will grab the invoice data from the Excel log and input into Oracle to create each invoice voucher. Fourth, the robot will register the status of each invoice in the Excel log with a processed or error message, depending on the outcome. And last, after all invoices have been processed, send an automatic email attaching the Excel log that includes the status of all invoices so a human can review the ones with errors. Now, let's get started. As the first step in the process, the robot will access the document management system where the invoices have been saved and indexed, and will extract the necessary information for each of the 4 invoices to be processed, and include this information in an Excel spreadsheet in 4 separate rows. In the next step, the robot will read the invoice data from the spreadsheet and use that data to create each invoice voucher in the ERP system. As you can see, there is enough information to create the invoices in the system, such as vendor number, invoice date, invoice amount, etc. There is a status column that was added to keep track of the outcome of each transaction with a processed or error message that will be updated by the robot for each record entered into the system. For this demonstration, we are going to use the Excel file named cnregularinvoices.xlsx. Now, we will begin the process, and the robot will start entering the invoices in Oracle. To begin, the robot will launch a web browser and go to the VPN portal to establish connection using the credentials provided for this purpose. Next, the robot will log into Oracle PeopleSoft with the provided username and password. Once in Oracle PeopleSoft, the robot will navigate to the voucher creation screen, simulating mouse actions same as a human user would do. One by one, all 4 invoices in our sample spreadsheet will be entered in PeopleSoft. The robot performs the data entry by clicking buttons, tabs, and typing values into the required fields. During this process, the robot also performs data type conversions to prevent validation errors based on business rules. At this point, the robot will process the invoices without interruption. Note that the processing speed can be improved if we tell the robot to not show us the step-by-step process on the screen. Now the system is telling us that there was an exception in the processing caused by a duplicate invoice number. The robot will pause and log the error before restarting the application to continue with the next record. Since there are no more invoices to enter, the robot will end the process and exit. It is time to open our Excel file and review the status of our 4 invoices. As we can see, 3 invoices were processed successfully, and 1 invoice was not processed due to the duplicate invoice number error. Our robot was configured to send an automatic email including the spreadsheet with the status of each processed invoice, so the invoices with the error status can be reviewed by a human. Instead of an email, the robot can also be configured to save this document in a shared folder, or to send the document to a physical printer. Before implementing RPA, this process used to take 5 minutes per invoice. 2 minutes indexing the invoice, and 3 minutes processing the invoice in Oracle. With RPA, the processing time was reduced to 2 minutes and 15 seconds. 2 minutes indexing the invoice. This part of the process is still manual. 15 seconds processing the invoice in Oracle. This means an overall processing time reduction of 55%. In addition to 67% more capacity in terms of invoices processed. This demo is an example of how RPA can generate significant cost reductions and productivity efficiencies in your back office operations, while also reducing human errors and increasing focus of your team on higher value activities.
So what you just saw was a very good example of the robotic capabilities, the ability to take a pretty basic transaction type, invoice processing, and allow it to take a lot of those elements and be automated. So what you saw is essentially we were gaining probably 60% efficiency gain in terms of the actual work effort that had to be performed, and all the human intervention that was required was at the front end, the indexing of the invoices themselves, and at the back end, the handling of any exceptions that the robotic environment couldn't handle. An exception can be multifaceted. It could be, error in the process. It could be a coding error. It could be an invoice entry error. It could be, mismatch of purchase order to the invoice price. But you can also create thresholds that allow you to have some judgment where the robot can say if it falls within this tolerance, we'll accept it. So there's a lot of capability you can create in the process and establish great levels of efficiency. That's a pretty standard, simple one. What I'd like to talk to you now about is another recent case study that we of a client that we did some analysis for in order to help them resolve a pretty significant business issue that they were having and gain great levels of efficiency and performance and lower their cost. So in this case, the client was an organization that's about a $2.5 billion global manufacturing company with about 60 plants across the world. What we were doing is we were looking at their North American operations, which was based primarily Canada, United States, and some in Mexico. But what this company really was, the challenge that they faced was it really wasn't one organization, but it was the result of a series of acquisitions of 4 or 5 different companies that were kind of pushed together to form this one operating entity. So what that meant was you had a number of different companies that had not been fully integrated and therefore were operating in a highly decentralized manner. So the byproduct was you had 23 plants running 13 different ERP systems, 4 different purchasing systems, 4 different receiving systems, and none of them talked to each other. So at the end of the day, each plant essentially was doing their own thing. Very difficult to get any scale, efficiency, operational benefit out of that. And the simple solution, replace them and standardize on one ERP system, was not a viable option. The acquiring company was not willing to make the investment, so they basically told them to figure out another way. Well, we came in to help them figure out the other way. And the other way that we came up with was to leverage robotics and drive performance that way by doing what I like to call normalizing the transaction, creating essentially a way to take these very decentralized, very diverse operations and bringing them all together in one place and allow a robot to perform most of the manual work automatically. The result was we took 23 different plants that were running these 13 systems and 4 different purchasing, 4 different receiving, and about 21 FTEs, and we were able to resolve it and bring it down to approximately 10 FTEs and 1 robot. So about a 50% cost savings was what they were able to achieve, and they were able to be up and running within 3 months. So compare that to the cost of implementing an ERP system and standardizing on platforms. And this was just one process that we looked at, but one that we were easily able to implement. Here's a little more visibility into what we were able to do. So what this is showing you in yellow is the processes that were still manual. So the first start of the process, if you look up where it says start and receive invoice, that was happening at the plant. So a plant would receive an invoice, or if it was a digital invoice received from a vendor, it would go to a centralized email box. And then from that point, the process would get picked up by a centralized team that they had done and consolidated their operations from all the local plants into one centralized location. So once the invoices were received, we still had a manual process of indexing and coding those invoices. And the reason for that was because all of the various invoice types, it was very difficult to use an OCR process and create great levels of efficiency there. So we felt it was better and more effective to just pull the data out that we needed, and at which point the robot would pick it up. The robot then picked up the information, received the invoice, and then compared that information to purchase order and receiving data that it was going out to the various plants on a daily basis and pulling into a centralized database. So as you can see, what we had here is we had this centralized database here that normalized all of the data transactions. It was pulling from the various plants all of the different receiving, purchase order, and invoice data, and the robot now only had to go here to do the three-way match. So the pulling of data, the movement of data, the data entry part of it was being done by the robot. The three-way match was being done by the robot. And the only thing that a person had to get involved in was exceptions. We were able to identify that once you establish appropriate business rules, about 90% of the transactions flowed straight through. So you were able to take those remaining 10% and had a user involved with it, perform the manual three-way match, resolve the issue, enter it back into the system. It would go through the same process and get completed. So at the end of the day, what you had was this highly complex, very challenging environment resolved with 21 people, resolved with one robot and 10 FTEs. And the other benefit that came out of this centralized database was now the company had tremendous visibility into what was happening at the various plants. So for example, they really had no good visibility into what was being acquired and bought from the various vendors at the plants. And so they weren't able to capture discounts, they weren't able to negotiate price because all of this data was not aggregated. It was aggregated at the payment end, but not at the front end. So now you had visibility into what was being bought, when, and by whom, and all of a sudden you were able to get much better control around that information. So not only did the robotic environment automate, and it provided greater levels of visibility into the operation. To see what the real impact was, this is truly this is what you're seeing in terms of benchmark study that we did. So what we looked at was, here is the current level of performance compared to benchmark data. So the red bar here on each of these lines represents where they compared. The blue lines represent the benchmark data, anywhere from bottom, medium, or top performer, and the gold was the robotic end result. So as you can see, in every level of performance, this client performed well below bottom performer in just about every category. Once the robotic environment was implemented, we were able to get them to not only medium performer, but in some cases very close to top performer production in an environment that was extremely difficult. You might ask, why couldn't they get the top performer production, being that they were using robots? And the answer was, you still had the complexity of their multiple systems and the need to go out and pull data from a lot of different places. If you truly standardized on one platform, and if you used robotics, I believe these numbers would have been achieved and even above that. But at the end of the day, this is probably as good as you're going to get with the challenging operating environment that they faced. And the client was very happy to get that type of result. So what it gave you was a real benefit, quick to achieve at a low cost investment. So let's talk quickly about what it takes to implement RPA. So what you need to understand about RPA, what people need to appreciate, is RPA is not a one-off thing. It's not a project. We like to say it's a journey, but really what it is it becomes an integral part of your operation. Every person in your organization is an important part of your business. While the robot takes on that similar persona, it becomes a part of your business that you need to constantly work with, manage, and improve upon. So it starts, we believe, with conducting a very thorough assessment of your business operations and what the opportunities are for RPA. There's a lot of confusion within business today about where RPA would fit, what the benefits are, what can I expect to receive from it, what's the level of investment I need to make. We highly recommend conducting an assessment across your business to look at the various options that are available to you and create an RPA roadmap that allows you to say, I'm going to start here, but then these are the other ones I'm going to achieve, and this is what I'm expecting to get out of it. I'll spend more time in our next webinar talking in more detail about what that assessment methodology is like and what you can expect to see from that. But I think it's important to really point out, and you need to understand and go into this with your eyes wide open and expect and know what you're going to expect to get. Once you've established the roadmap, we recommend starting small. Do a proof of concept, start with the POC, and then once the POC is implemented, monitor the performance of it so you see how well it's doing, where can I improve upon it, and what lessons can I take to employ for the other future implementations I'm going to do. And then once you know that and comfortable that the operation is stable, start to roll out the next levels of RPA. We don't recommend going RPA big bang. We recommend RPA doing it in smaller steps, managing it. And remember that RPA is going to need the ongoing support. So at the end of the day, it's not just about building the robots, but it's about managing the operation. So this becomes another level of support that you're going to need. Again, we'll spend more time on that in the next webinar. This gives you just a quick idea of what the assessment methodology will do. It's starting over here, you're basically walking through the entire operation to understand where the opportunities are. This essentially is really talking to the business units and to the functions and to the departments and even in some cases to the people performing the work to understand how a transaction is performed. From that will come out a number of different opportunities and determine where the prioritization of those opportunities are. So the quick wins typically are going to be where you get the highest level of return on investment. It's going to be low risk to the business, but it also categorizes in other areas that are unique to RPA. So it looks at the systems infrastructure, for example, to determine what areas have the simplest RPA deployment requirements based on the infrastructure that exists. There are certain criteria in an operation that makes it more challenging for RPA to be successful and to be effective. So you need to account for that when you do your prioritization. At the end of the day, you create your roadmap, and the roadmap will essentially identify the various opportunities and the sequencing and timing around each of them. So these steps we strongly recommend are the way you get into this process. And again, in the next webinar, we'll spend a lot more time talking about that. So from today's session, I think it's important to have the following takeaways. It starts with why RPA. So if you're in a business that's under pressure to perform, to change, to lower cost, to increase efficiencies, to be more scalable, and frankly, who isn't in today's world, you need to look at ways to achieve those type of benefits quickly, low cost, without a lot of impact to your business. RPA is clearly a great tool to achieve this. And the thing to note is it's not something that's in the future. It's happening right now. You're seeing it everywhere you go. Companies are implementing it. Companies are employing it. Companies are starting to leverage and achieve the benefits of it. Your competitors definitely are. You need to be looking at this as a solution for yourselves now, or you're going to find that you're going to be behind the curve pretty quickly. What RPA brings you is another solution besides a large-scale systems implementations that are costly and time-consuming to implement. So RPA gives you this tool that allows for efficiencies that can be achieved quickly without a lot of pain and suffering in your business. And anybody who's gone through large-scale systems implementations know what that means. Another important consideration, RPA is not a project, it's a journey, it's not a one-off, and you really need to understand what it takes to implement, what your benefits are that you're going to get out of it, and then how you're going to manage this process going forward. Given that most IT organizations and most business units don't have a lot of this knowledge today, we do recommend working with a partner. We happen to be one that can provide this type of expertise and knowledge and guidance. Whether or not you choose to do this in an in-house fashion or you choose to do it with a partner, regardless of that decision, at the end of the day, the guidance of how to get started is critical, because those first steps are what's going to make the success or failure of your initiative. And then lastly, we recommend starting small and testing. Take the time to understand what it is that exists in your organization, where the opportunities are, and set realistic goals and expectations about that. So when you implement, you know what you have a target that you want to achieve, and you have a way to measure that you've achieved it. This is an important part of this too, and it's part of the methodology that we recommend. So in our next webinar, which is on November 2nd, hope to see you all there. We'll spend more time talking about those type of elements, the next steps that are involved in the process, how to assess, how to identify the opportunities, how to create your roadmap. We'll also look at what's out there in the market today, who are the vendors you should be looking for, and how do they compare, and we'll talk about the support models that exist in your organization. We're also going to spend some time talking about how to embrace it, your workforce around it, because that's going to be one of the challenges is resistance culturally and operationally to this type of change, but also, you know, the fear that people are going to have of losing their jobs. Well, there may be some of that, but at the end of the day, what this really should drive is higher value work and changing people's jobs into a higher value job. I think if you kind of position it that way, many people are going to not only be receptive to it, they'll embrace it. So we'll talk more about that in the next webinar. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Yaslin to see if there's any questions and any other points that she'd like to make. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. That was a great presentation, and I think it was a great intro to RPA. I know we're a little bit over time, so I'm going to open it up for questions for whoever wants to stay on. But before anyone goes away, as part of a giveaway to all of our attendees for joining us today, we're offering a free 1-hour RPA consultation with Eric and his team. To hopefully help you with jumpstarting your RPA journey. And if you sign up, you'll be eligible to receive a free training by UiPath, which is a 4-hour online training, and it's a $600 value. So if you're interested, you'll see the email up on the screen. That's our marketing manager, fabiana.corredor@auxis.com. I've also sent the contact information in your chat, so you can reach out to Eric or Fabiana if you have any other questions. You can contact Eric directly. And we hope, as Eric mentioned, we hope you'll join us for part 2 on November 2nd, diving into RPA. And you'll each receive a reminder email because you guys signed up for the series, so you're automatically signed up for the second one. So we'll open it up for questions. Let's see. So, there's a question for me. Will this PowerPoint slide deck be sent out after the call? Yes, of course. You'll receive a follow-up email once the webinar is over. You'll receive access to the slides and to the recording. So there's another question here, Eric. How do I know how many robots I need in my organization?
Great question, and one that I get asked a lot, and I kind of alluded to it in the webinar itself. And really, ultimately, it's a math exercise. Once you look at the processes that you're going to employ robots in, you literally need to break it down into its various components, the time it takes to perform a transaction, and the volume of transactions that exist. And you plot that out, and you create a time cycle that the robot will perform it in. And once you get that data available to you, you can calculate the amount of robots. But you'd be surprised at how much one robot can do in the course of a 24-hour day. So one of the great advantages of robotics is you don't necessarily need armies of robots. You don't need dozens of robots to perform traditional back office tasks. A couple of robots will bring tremendous benefit. But the assessment that we're talking about, and we'll spend more time providing details on in the next session, will give you more insight into that.
Okay, thanks, Eric. There's another question here. What is the difference between RPA and artificial intelligence or cognitive intelligence? How do they relate?
Again, another question that I get a lot of, because a lot of people are curious about both. And really what RPA is the transactional or automated work activity part of this entire concept. So RPA, robotics process automation, allows you to essentially automate tasks and let a computer drive the activities. So it creates that process. What artificial intelligence or cognitive intelligence does is it adds another element to that, another layer of machine learning, of computer learning, where they're starting to understand the nuances of a transaction so that so various judgments can be made. So for example, a common use of cognitive intelligence is in what we call chatbots. You have a customer asking a question on a website or some other resource, and the robot starts to understand what the question is based on some keywords in that questions, and it can provide answers back. So it's providing not just a transactional response, but a judgment-based response based on the information that's being given. Another example would be approving a certain type of transaction. Credit would be a good example. So once the intelligence is applied, you could create criteria that says anybody who achieves this level of a rating, you can approve. Anybody who achieves this level of rating, you decline. And anybody who achieves this level of rating, you ask for more information and specifically what that is. The robot learns from your process, from your rules, and applies those rules to the transaction itself. So it gives you the ability to provide a higher level of judgment. It requires more computing power, more throughput, more it's somewhat of a higher cost, and it's still in the process of being developed. So there's a lot of good applications of it, but it's a lot more that's coming. RPA is going to be the more transactional nature of that.
Okay, and we have time for one more question. How complex is it to incorporate data capture from the paper documents into the task carried out by RPA?
Again, that depends on the type of documents that you're pulling in. What we showed you, the example we showed in the video, we elected not to use data capture. We elected to manually index those documents. In other words, we elected to manually pull the key data elements out and drop it into a form. The reason for that is because the invoice form typically doesn't lend itself well to a data capture process. Why? Because you have to teach the OCR engine what various data elements mean and how to interpret that data. So if something is in a different format every time and the terminology doesn't always apply and it's different, it's much more difficult for the OCR engine to work effectively. So we're typically seeing 40–50% success rates on these type of transactions. So if it's a standard form, standard type of information, and you can define it, it can work really well. So a great application, as an example, would be use OCR for your key vendors, for the majority of vendors, because I can create the standard formats for those, say, top 10 vendors, and all of that can be converted through an OCR process and just manually index the rest of it. You have to look at the process, understand what the challenges of the document itself is, and how well the computer will adapt to it, and make a judgment call on that. Again, something when we analyze a process, we look at all those elements and we recommend how we think to proceed.
Okay, I'll squeeze in two more questions. What prerequisites in terms of skills and competencies are needed to learn RPA concepts and tools?
Okay, so there's two, I'm going to answer that in two ways. So there's two sides. There's the operation side, and then there's the technical side. Let's first talk about the operation side. So on the operation side, it's a combination of truly understanding an operation and how it works. Because when you design an RPA process, what you're doing is you're breaking down that process into its various steps, and all of the elements of those steps, every task, every exception, every route that a transaction would take, you need to basically capture that. So a strong operations person, a business analyst type mindset who's good at understanding the nuances of a process and capturing that, and can understand how a robot would work, would be kind of the basic skill set you need. So if you're purely looking at it from a clerk's flow, it's going to be harder. So you need to have a little bit more perspective analytically. Now, on the technical side, it truly is an IT task. You need to be a developer. Now, it's a certain development skill set. It's not necessarily a .NET developer or one of those type of technologies, but those are good skill sets to have. You're going to learn essentially it's a scripting exercise, it's a coding exercise, and to a certain extent, it's like creating macros in Excel. Anybody who's ever created a macro in Excel, that's the basics of the RPA type of transaction that you're doing with coding to support it. So IT programming skill set, knowledge, and experience generally is needed on that end of the business. Any other questions? Hello?
Sorry about that,
Hello?
Eric. Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. There's one more question. Is the cultural and/or the mindset change the biggest challenge when proposing RPA to business decision makers?
Yes, sort of. I think the first thing that you have to, what companies face when they make this decision is they get all excited about the cost savings and the efficiencies. So they tend to forget about the impact to people. That starts to bleed in as you start to get down into more of the operational levels. But at the end of the day, you're going to get resistance. But the reality is you're going to also get some levels of acceptance because certain people are going to look at this as a way to improve their job, not to replace their job. And that's how you try to overcome the challenge. But yes, at the end of the day, the over-enthusiasm of the potential for cost savings and efficiency, and the fear of losing control, the fear of the impact to people, those are the challenges that you typically face, and you have to balance all of that properly. Any other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, or if
There's no
my
other
robot...
questions. I was just waiting to see if there was any more, but no, I think we're through with the questions. So just as a reminder, everyone's going to receive a survey on the presentation. We'd appreciate your feedback, and watch out for the follow-up email with a link to today's recording and the access to the slides. So on behalf of Auxis and Eric, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.